I signed my own divorce papers without a single tear, and 3 weeks later I stood in the back row of my ex-husband's wedding watching his new bride walk down the aisle in white lace, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. Because I recognized her, not from a photograph on his phone, not from some jealous scroll through social media. I recognized her from a federal case file I wasn't allowed to talk about. My name is Dakota Pierce, and this is the story of how staying silent became the most powerful thing I ever did. I'd been gone for 4 months. Field deployment, the kind where you learn to sleep sitting up and stop noticing the smell of diesel because it's just the smell of everything now. When I finally walked through my own front door duffel bag still slung over one shoulder, I expected the usual Ethan's arms around me, maybe a late dinner, the dog going insane in the hallway. Instead, I found my husband sitting at the kitchen table with a manila folder squared off in front of him, like he'd rehearsed the placement. He didn't stand up. "Sign it," he said. "I've found the woman I'm supposed to be with." I set my bag down slowly. 14 years in the Army teaches you a lot of things, but the most useful one might be this: how to keep your face still when your chest is doing something else entirely. I looked at the folder. I looked at him. His jaw was set in that way it used to get before a difficult conversation with his father, like he'd built a wall around himself in advance so nothing could get through. I didn't ask who she was. I didn't ask how long. I didn't ask why 4 months of silence had led to this exact moment at this exact table, with this exact folder already printed and tabbed. I just opened it, found the signature line, and signed my name. Ethan blinked. I think some part of him had been braced for a fight. Maybe he'd wanted one, some proof that I'd cared enough to scream. Instead, I capped the pen, slid the folder back across the table, and asked if he'd fed the dog. He hadn't. That night I lay in the guest room because apparently it was already the guest room in his mind before I'd even come home, and I stared at the ceiling and waited to feel something crack open in me. It didn't come. What came instead was quiet. Not the good kind. The kind that settles in after a controlled explosion when you've already run the numbers and you know exactly how much damage to expect and exactly where the walls will hold. People at Ethan's law firm start work early, so within a week the whole social circle we'd shared for a decade knew. I could feel it in the texts. Little check-ins from women I used to have book club with, women who suddenly wanted to know if I was doing okay, their sentences trailing into ellipses like they expected me to fall apart mid-message. I answered everyone the same way. "Fine, busy at work, thanks for checking in." I went back to base 3 days later in a pressed uniform, hair pulled back regulation tight, and did my job like nothing in my personal life had shifted at all. My commanding officer asked once carefully if everything was all right at home. I told him home was being renovated. He didn't push, and I didn't explain that the renovation in question involved my entire marriage being gutted down to the studs. A week after that came the wedding invitation. Cream cardstock gold foil lettering. My own name spelled out in calligraphy like the universe wanted to make sure I understood the joke completely. "Ethan Walker and Sophia Grant request the honor of your presence." I stood in my kitchen holding it for a long moment, and I want to be honest about what I felt because this isn't a story about a woman too strong to feel anything. I felt something sharp move through my ribs. Not jealousy exactly. Something closer to disbelief at the speed of it all. 4 months, and already a full wedding, a full new life, printed invitations sent out like save the dates for a reunion I hadn't been told I was uninvited from. I set the invitation on the counter and made coffee. That evening a text came through from Ethan, directly the first he'd sent me since I'd signed. "Hope you're happy for us," it read with a photo attached, him and a woman I hadn't met yet. Her face turned slightly away from the camera, laughing at something outside the frame. I looked at that photo longer than I meant to. Something about the angle of her jaw felt familiar in a way I couldn't place, yet some itch at the back of my memory that I chalked up to exhaustion and old grief, doing what old grief does, conjuring ghosts out of strangers. I typed back 2 words. "Congratulations," I wrote, and set the phone face down on the counter. My best friend Rachel called an hour later, furious on my behalf, asking how I could be so calm about a man throwing away 14 years for someone he'd known a fraction of that time. I told her calm wasn't a choice I was making. It was simply where I lived now in the after of things, in the flat, quiet space where you've already absorbed the worst news and you're just waiting to see what comes next. What I didn't tell her, what I couldn't tell anyone yet, was that something about that photograph had already started working on me. A low hum underneath the numbness, a name trying to surface from years back from a different uniform and a different desk, and a case file with a woman's face in it that I'd been ordered never to discuss again. I went to bed that night not grieving my marriage. I went to bed wondering where I'd seen her before. I told myself I wasn't going for him. I told myself that 3 separate times, while I stood in my closet choosing between 2 dresses that suddenly both felt wrong on my body, like I was dressing for a court appearance instead of a wedding. In the end, I chose the navy one simple nothing that said I was trying, nothing that said I wasn't. I told Rachel I was going out of curiosity, and that was true as far as it went. What I didn't say was that the itch in the back of my mind hadn't faded since that photograph. If anything, it had sharpened the way a word sits on the tip of your tongue for days until it finally drops into place. The ceremony was held at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of venue with string lights strung between olive trees, and a string quartet warming up under a pergola, everything curated to look effortless while costing a small fortune. I recognized half the guest list. Ethan's mother in emerald green holding court near the front row like she'd planned the seating chart herself. His college roommate, now heavier around the middle, nodding at me with an expression caught somewhere between pity and discomfort. A few of my old friends, the ones who'd stayed loyal to me on paper but clearly hadn't wanted to skip a vineyard wedding over it, gave me small, apologetic waves from across the aisle. I took a seat near the back, far enough that I could leave quickly if I needed to. Close enough that I could see everything. When the quartet shifted into the processional, the entire crowd turned as one, the way crowds do, faces lifting toward the aisle like sunflowers finding the light. I turned with them out of nothing but the instinct. And then I saw her. She walked slowly, deliberately, her hand resting light on her father's, or a man playing the part of her father I'd learn later, arm veil catching the afternoon light in a way that was, I'll admit, beautiful. Her face was composed into that soft, practiced wedding smile every bride wears. But it wasn't the smile that stopped me cold in my seat. It was the bone structure beneath it, the particular tilt of her chin. A small scar near her left eyebrow, faint, the kind you'd only notice if you'd spent hours staring at a case photo trying to memorize every identifying feature of a woman. The Army had asked me to help track down years before deployment ever took me anywhere near this life. I felt my pulse do something strange, not panic, more like recognition arriving all at once, a door swinging open on a room I'd been told to forget existed. Olivia Brooks. That was the name on the file I'd worked years ago, back when I was pulled in as legal liaison supporting a federal task force, investigating a pattern of financial fraud and identity theft that stretched across 6 states. Olivia Brooks, a woman who didn't exist anywhere before the age of 25, who surfaced under that name just long enough to marry a hedge fund manager in Charleston, drain his accounts within 18 months, and vanish before the ink dried on the annulment paperwork. We'd built half a case around her before she slipped through a gap in jurisdiction, and the file went cold-sealed under a classification I wasn't permitted to speak about, even after I left that assignment. And here she was. Different hair. Different name stitched into the wedding program in delicate script. Sophia Grant. But the same woman walking down an aisle toward my ex-husband with the same rehearsed serenity I remembered from a surveillance photo, taken outside a Charleston courthouse. I almost laughed. I want to be honest about that because it wasn't triumph, and it wasn't cruelty. It was something closer to the involuntary sound you make when the universe hands you a joke so precise it feels engineered. I pressed my knuckles briefly against my mouth and turned it into a cough. Rachel, seated beside me, leaned in. "You okay?" "Fine," I said. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged, the kind that always sound sincere in the moment, regardless of what's underneath them. Ethan's voice cracked slightly when he said, "For better or worse." And I watched Sophia's face carefully as he said it, looking for some flicker of guilt, some hairline fracture in the performance. I found nothing. She was good. She'd always been good according to the file. That was, after all, the entire skill set. At the reception under those string lights, a woman I vaguely recognized from Ethan's office leaned toward me with a glass of champagne already loosening her filter. "Why are you smiling like that?" she asked. I'd expect you to be devastated." I considered several answers. I settled on the truth filtered down to something safe enough to say out loud. "Because I know something no one else here does." She laughed like I'd made a joke, clinked her glass against mine, and drifted off toward the dance floor. I stood near the edge of the tent for a while longer, watching Ethan spin his new wife under the lights, watching his mother dab at happy tears, watching a room full of people I used to consider close friends celebrate a woman whose real name I still didn't know for certain. I thought about the file, about the non-disclosure agreement I'd signed under federal seal, the kind that doesn't expire just because your personal life happens to collide with the subject of the investigation. I thought about the consequences of speaking even one sentence out of turn: obstruction, breach of classified material, the swift and unglamorous end of a career I'd built for 14 years, brick by brick. I thought about Ethan's face if I walked over right now and said her real name out loud in front of 200 guests. I didn't do it. Instead, I finished my glass of wine, set it down on a passing tray, and walked quietly toward the gravel parking lot, gravel crunching under my heels in the dark. I didn't say goodbye to Ethan. I didn't say goodbye to his mother. I didn't say a single word to the bride. I got in my car, closed the door, and sat there for a long moment in the silence, keys in my lap, staring at the vineyard lights glowing warm and gold through the windshield. Then I drove home, already knowing something the rest of that tent full of happy people had no way of understanding yet. The story of Sophia Grant was not a beginning. It was a chapter I'd already read the ending of. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over you after you've made a decision you know most people wouldn't understand. I drove home from that vineyard with the windows cracked, cold air cutting through the cabin of the car, and I let myself sit with the question that would follow me for months afterward. Why didn't I say something? Why didn't I grab Ethan by the sleeve at the reception and pull him into some quiet corner and tell him the truth about the woman he'd just married? It would have been so easy in a way. One sentence, 5 words maybe. That's not her real name. But easy isn't the same as possible, and it isn't the same as right. To understand why I stayed silent, you have to go back further than that wedding, further than the divorce, further even than the day Ethan and I first met at a mutual friend's barbecue, back when we were both young enough to believe love solved everything. You have to go back to a stretch of my career I don't talk about often. 3 years. I spent seconded to a joint task force as legal liaison, back when the Army loaned out a handful of officers with legal backgrounds to support federal investigations that crossed military and civilian jurisdiction. The case that landed on my desk involved a pattern nobody had been able to pin down for years. Women, always different names, always different cities, who targeted men with real assets. Business owners, retired officers with pensions, a widowed dentist in Savannah, a hedge fund manager in Charleston. The pattern was always the same: fast romance, faster marriage, total financial merger within months. And then, without fail, disappearance accounts drained down to the last cent, the woman gone before anyone thought to call it what it was. Olivia Brooks was the alias we'd gotten closest to identifying. We had partial fingerprints from a rental application, a handwriting sample from a forged reference letter, and one grainy surveillance photo from outside a Charleston courthouse, the day her second marriage was quietly annulled. We built most of a case. We were maybe 6 weeks from an indictment when funding shifted, jurisdiction disputes ate up another 2 months, and then she vanished entirely, the way people like that always seem to know exactly when to vanish, like they can smell an indictment coming the way some animals smell a storm. The file was sealed. Not shelved, sealed under a classification tied to an ongoing multi-state investigation that technically never closed, just went dormant. I signed paperwork acknowledging that anything I'd learned in that assignment stayed in that assignment permanently under penalty of obstruction charges and the swift end of a career that had taken me from a nervous second lieutenant to someone finally trusted with real responsibility. That kind of agreement doesn't come with an expiration date for personal convenience. It doesn't ask whether the subject of the file happens to marry your ex-husband 11 years later. So when I sat in the back row of that vineyard wedding and recognized her, what I was looking at wasn't just a face. It was a legal tripwire. One wrong word and I wasn't protecting Ethan. I was potentially blowing up a federal case that might, for all I knew, still be quietly building against her in some office I no longer had access to. I thought about calling my old supervisor that very night, and I almost did my thumb hovering over his name in my contacts for a long time before I set the phone down. There was something else too, something less about law and more about the 14 years I'd just spent married to a man who had never once, not one single time, taken my instincts seriously. I thought back to all the small warnings I'd given Ethan over the years, warnings that had nothing to do with classified files and everything to do with ordinary judgment. The business partner I'd told him seemed evasive about the numbers, the one who later disappeared with half the company's operating capital. The college friend I'd said felt off, the one who eventually got Ethan roped into a timeshare scheme that cost him thousands. Every single time Ethan had laughed, the same laugh patted my hand, the same way said the same words. "You're paranoid, Dakota. Not everyone's running an angle." After the divorce papers were signed after the wedding, I finally let myself sit with something I'd been avoiding for a long time. There are people who only learn from being told, and there are people who only learn from living through it themselves, no matter how many times you try to hand them the lesson early. Ethan had always been the second kind. It wasn't cruelty on his part, not exactly. It was a kind of stubborn optimism, an unwillingness to believe the world could be as calculating as I sometimes told him it was. That optimism had made him easy to love once. It also made him exactly the kind of man someone like Sophia Grant knew how to find. I remember sitting in my car in my own driveway that night after the wedding engine offhand, still on the wheel, working through the shape of the decision I was making. Not a decision to hurt him. Not a decision born out of spite, no matter how it might look from the outside years later. A decision simply that some truths cannot be forced into a person from the outside. They have to arrive on their own timeline in their own weight, or they don't stick at all. I said it out loud to no one, just to hear how it sounded. I won't interfere. The truth always catches up. It felt less like giving up and more like finally putting down something heavy I'd been carrying for 14 years without realizing it, the exhausting work of trying to protect a man from consequences he refused to believe were possible. I walked inside, hung my coat by the door, and for the first time since the divorce papers, I slept without waking once in the night. Whatever was coming for Ethan and the woman calling herself Sophia Grant, it was coming with or without my help. I decided to let it come. 3 months passed, and I heard about Ethan's new life the way most people hear about their ex-spouse's new life after a divorce secondhand, filtered through mutual friends who couldn't quite hide the mix of concern and gossip in their voices, through the occasional post that showed up on my feed before I finally muted his name entirely. What I gathered piece by piece was a picture that would have alarmed anyone paying close attention, if anyone had actually been paying close attention. Ethan sold the house first. Our house, technically the one that had gone to him in the settlement along with most of our joint savings, since I'd been the one to walk away without a fight over assets I no longer wanted a claim to. He sold it faster than made sense for a property in that market, and moved into a newly built place across town with Sophia, something modern with too much glass and not enough character, the kind of house that photographs well and feels like nothing when you're standing inside it. Then came the investment accounts. Ethan had always been careful with money, methodical, in a way that used to frustrate me during our marriage spreadsheets for everything retirement contributions calculated to the dollar. That caution seemed to evaporate within weeks of the wedding. He liquidated a chunk of his portfolio, something Rachel heard from his sister at a baby shower, and rolled it into a joint account with Sophia's name added as primary, not secondary holder. I heard Sophia had a phrase she liked to use whenever anyone questioned the pace of things. Married people shouldn't keep secrets, she'd say, soft and reasonable, the kind of sentence that sounds like intimacy and functions like a crowbar. It was, I recognized immediately, a page straight out of the pattern I'd studied years earlier. Merge finances quickly. Frame any hesitation as a lack of trust. Make transparency the price of love. And make withholding feel like betrayal. Ethan, from everything I heard, fell for every line of it and fell harder each time. Friends described him as more in love than he'd ever seemed with me, which stung less than I expected it to and more than I wanted to admit. His mother, a woman who had never particularly warmed to me across 14 years of holidays and birthdays, began telling anyone who would listen how wonderful Sophia was, how attentive, how different from what she diplomatically called Ethan's first marriage. I ran into her once at a pharmacy of all places, both of us reaching for the same allergy medication display. She looked at me the way you look at something slightly unfortunate you'd rather not discuss, then softened it with a comment clearly meant to be kind and landed instead like a small blade between the ribs. "Sophia knows how to make a man happy," she said, adjusting her purse strap like it was information I'd requested. I smiled at her, the same smile I'd been wearing since the divorce papers, the one that had started to feel less like armor, and more like an actual expression of how I felt calm, a little amused, entirely unbothered in a way that clearly unsettled people more than tears would have. I didn't respond. I paid for my prescription and left. What none of them saw, what none of them could have seen, was the quieter machinery running underneath the fairy tale. I only learned the details later once everything came apart, and the full picture assembled itself in hindsight the way these things always do. While Ethan's mother was praising her new daughter-in-law at church socials, Sophia was opening credit lines under Ethan's good name, and hers combined 3 different cards within 2 months, each one maxed within weeks on purchases that never quite made sense. Jewelry appraisals, wire transfers to accounts in other states, cash advances routed through channels designed to be hard to trace. She took out a personal loan against the equity in the new house, co-signed naturally, since marriage made that simple. She changed the beneficiary designation on Ethan's life insurance policy, a form he apparently signed without reading closely, distracted he'd later admit by how attentive she'd been about everything else that week, how she'd cooked his favorite dinner, how she'd made the paperwork feel like the smallest part of an otherwise perfect evening. None of it happened in one dramatic sweep. That was the skill of it, the thing that had made her so hard to catch the first time and the second time, and however many times there had been before Ethan. It happened slowly, almost gently, each individual step small enough to explain away each conversation, warm enough to disguise the machinery turning underneath it. A husband distracted by love rarely audits the fine print. I wasn't watching closely enough to catch every detail as it happened, and I want to be honest about that too. I'd built a wall of distance on purpose, telling myself I had no right and no legal ability to intervene. But the call came eventually in early spring from a name I hadn't heard in years, a retired federal investigator I'd worked alongside during that original task force, a woman named Grace Whitfield, who'd stayed close enough to a handful of old cases to notice when a name resurfaced in a new financial system flagged under an algorithm built specifically to catch patterns like this one. I picked up on the 3rd ring standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. "She's active again," Grace said, no greeting, no preamble, just the 4 words I'd been half expecting since the moment I saw that face at the vineyard. I closed my eyes. I didn't ask which alias. I didn't ask for details I wasn't cleared to have yet. I simply thanked her for the call, set my phone down on the counter, and stood there for a long moment in the quiet of my kitchen, feeling the last piece of some old patient certainty finally click into place. Whatever was coming for Ethan, it was already closer than he understood. Grace's call stayed with me for days afterward, sitting in the back of my mind the way a storm warning sits with you even on a clear afternoon. That low awareness that the sky is going to change, even though nothing above you looks different yet. I didn't reach out to Ethan. I still wasn't in a position to legally or otherwise, and some part of me, the part that had spent 14 years learning exactly how little he trusted my instincts, knew that even if I could have warned him, he wouldn't have believed a word of it. Not from me, not about her. So I waited the way I'd learned to wait through deployments and long nights in cases that took years to resolve. I went to work. I ran drills. I signed off on paperwork and ate dinner alone, and slept reasonably well, all things considered, for a woman who knew a reckoning was somewhere on its way toward people she used to call family. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, according to what I pieced together later. Ethan woke up to an empty side of the bed, which wasn't unusual in itself. Sophia had taken to leaving early some mornings for what she called client meetings, vague enough that no one thought to question the specifics. What was unusual was that her side of the closet was empty too. Not disheveled, not in the middle of packing. Empty the way a hotel room looks after checkout hangers still on the rod, nothing left behind that could identify who had stayed there. The house safe. The one Ethan had installed himself the year before as a gesture of security for their new life together, stood open, its contents gone. Cash he'd kept for emergencies. The emergency fund itself wired out of their joint account overnight in 3 separate transfers, small enough to avoid automatic fraud flags. Her car leased under his credit was gone from the driveway. Even the jewelry he'd bought her for their 3-month anniversary, a piece he'd been quietly proud of, sat in the drawer he expected to find it in. Except it didn't. That was gone too. He called her phone first the way anyone would, straight to a voicemail box that within 24 hours would tell him the number had been disconnected. He called her office next, the marketing firm she claimed to work for, and reached a receptionist who had never heard her name, who transferred him twice before someone finally told him, kindly but firmly, that no one by that name had ever worked there. By the time he thought to check his other accounts, the credit cards, the personal loan, the newly adjusted life insurance policy, the picture had already assembled itself into something he couldn't unsee. Every document with her signature on it carried a name that, according to the county records office, belonged to no verifiable person at all. The police became involved within the week once the scale of it became clear, once Ethan sat across from a detective and had to admit with a kind of hollow embarrassment, I imagine was its own particular hell, that he couldn't produce a single piece of paperwork proving his wife had ever legally existed under the name he'd married. His mother called me during that stretch, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened. She didn't apologize for the pharmacy comment, didn't apologize for years of quiet disapproval. She just cried into the phone asking a question that didn't really have an answer. How could this happen, she kept saying over and over, like repetition might eventually produce a different result. How could this happen to my son? I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that it had happened before to other men in other cities under other names, and that the mechanism for how it happened had been sitting in a sealed federal file for over a decade. I simply told her I was sorry she was going through this, which was true, and left it there. I read about the rest in the news the way most people did. A local station picked up the story. First, local businessman defrauded by wife using false identity. And within days, it had been folded into something larger because Grace's tip had been right. Sophia Grant wasn't operating alone in the sense of being a first-time offender starting fresh. She was a known pattern re-emerging, and once investigators pulled her financial trail, it connected backward through at least 2 other marriages in 2 other states over the preceding 6 years, each one ending the same way, each one leaving a man standing in an empty house, wondering how he'd missed every sign. The FBI reopened the old task force file, the one I'd worked on years earlier, once new victims came forward, and the pattern became undeniable. I received a formal notice about it, a courtesy call from someone in the Bureau's regional office, letting me know that my prior involvement might be relevant again, that portions of the file could be declassified given the active new investigation. I sat with that news quietly in my own kitchen, in the same spot where I'd once stood holding a wedding invitation, with my own name spelled out in gold foil calligraphy. Then I thought of Ethan somewhere across town, staring at old photographs he'd probably pulled up in some desperate, sleepless attempt to understand what had happened to him. I imagined him laying them side by side, one after another, the way I once had in a case file years ago. Sophia, Olivia. A third name, Emma, that surfaced in the reopened investigation tied to a marriage in Ohio that had ended in similarly sudden fashion. 3 names. 3 lives destroyed in careful, patient succession. One face unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for underneath all of them. He found me on a Thursday evening standing on my own porch as the sun dropped low behind the tree line, the kind of golden hour light that makes even hard conversations feel like they're being staged for a camera that isn't there. I heard the car before I saw it, an unfamiliar sedan pulling into my driveway, and some part of me knew before he even stepped out that it was him. 14 years of marriage leaves an imprint on the sound of somebody's footsteps, even after everything that had happened between us. He looked different. Thinner somehow, though it had only been months. His shirt was wrinkled in a way I'd never seen on him before, not even during our worst arguments back when appearances still mattered enough to him that he'd iron a shirt before a fight. His eyes had a hollowed quality, the look of a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks and had stopped expecting to. "You knew," he said before I'd even said hello. No greeting, just those 2 words thrown at me like an accusation he'd been rehearsing the entire drive over. I didn't pretend not to understand. The moment she walked down the aisle, I said, keeping my voice level, not cold, just steady the way you'd deliver difficult news to someone you still on some level cared about. He flinched like I'd struck him. Why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked on the last word, climbing toward something raw. Dakota, why the hell didn't you say something? Do you have any idea what she took from me? What she did to my mother watching me fall apart? You could have stopped this before it even started and you just... He stopped pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, breathing hard. I let him finish before I answered because he needed to get it out, and because some small, honest part of me understood the anger even if I didn't accept the blame underneath it. Because I wasn't allowed to, I said, and because you wouldn't have believed me. He looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. What does that even mean? Wasn't allowed to Dakota, we were married. If you knew something like this, I signed a federal non-disclosure agreement 11 years ago. I said, cutting through gently but firmly. Before I ever met you, before either one of us knew this life existed, there was a case, a woman using multiple identities to defraud men across half a dozen states. I worked it as legal liaison during my time seconded to that task force. She was a suspect. The file was sealed when the investigation stalled. I couldn't discuss it with anyone, not you, not my own mother. Breaking that seal wasn't just a betrayal of trust, Ethan, it was a federal offense. It could have ended my career. It could have compromised whatever was left of an active investigation. I watched the information land on him slowly, piece by piece, his face shifting from anger toward something closer to confusion, then toward a kind of dawning horror as the timeline assembled itself in his mind. You knew her, he said quietly. Before me. Before any of this. I knew a version of her, I said. A name in a file. A face in a surveillance photo taken outside a courthouse in Charleston. I didn't know she'd end up standing at an altar in front of you. I recognized her the second she walked down that aisle, and by then there was nothing legal I could do that wouldn't have made things worse for you or for the case. He sat down on the porch step without asking, dropping onto it like his legs had simply stopped negotiating with the rest of him. I let him sit there for a moment before I went inside and came back out with a folder I'd been given the week before once the Bureau formally notified me that portions of the old file had been declassified in light of the reopened investigation. I hadn't shown it to anyone yet. I hadn't been sure I would show it to him at all until I saw his face on my porch and understood he needed to see it more than he needed anything else from me right then. I sat beside him and opened it. Her real name, first the one attached to a birth certificate from a small town in Kentucky, a name that bore no resemblance to Sophia Grant or Olivia Brooks, or the third alias Emma Whitfield that had surfaced in Ohio. Her actual photograph taken years earlier during a booking that never led to charges because the case had fallen apart on a jurisdictional technicality, and beneath that page after page 3, prior marriages. Before Ethan's, each one ending in disappearance within 18 months, each one preceded by the same quiet financial merger, the same slow erosion of trust, dressed up as intimacy. Ethan went through it in silence, his hands trembling slightly as he turned each page, and I watched something in him break in real time. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet internal collapse. The specific grief of realizing that an entire chapter of your life had been built on a foundation that never existed at all. She wasn't even real, he said finally so softly I almost didn't hear it. The woman I married, the woman I left you for, she was never even a real person. I didn't answer that because there was nothing kind or useful to say to it. I just sat with him on that porch step as the light faded fully out of the sky. Two people who had once built a life together, now bound by nothing except the wreckage of what had come after it until he finally stood, thanked me in a voice stripped down to almost nothing and drove away into the dark. A year passed the way years do after something breaks a life open slowly at first, and then all at once the way healing tends to work when you stop fighting its pace. Sophia. I still think of her by that name even now, because it's the one I watched her where the longest, was arrested in a state 2,000 miles from where any of this began, caught renewing the same pattern under yet another identity, a widowed contractor. This time, a man fortunate enough to have a suspicious accountant who flagged the transfers before they finished draining his savings. The federal case that followed absorbed everything. My old file, the one I'd carried in silence for over a decade, finally saw daylight in full cross-referenced against victims in 5 states going back nearly 9 years. I was called to testify, which felt strange. In a way I hadn't anticipated, sitting in a courtroom describing a woman I'd once known only as a name on a surveillance photo, now facing multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and financial exploitation. I answered every question calmly, the same way I'd signed those divorce papers, the same way I'd sat through that wedding. Some things I'd learned are easier to survive if you let your training carry you through them instead of your feelings. Ethan lost more than money, though the money alone was significant. Nearly everything he'd built across a decade of careful saving, gone into accounts that would take investigators years to fully trace, some of it never recovered at all. He lost the house sold at a loss to cover legal fees. He lost his position at the firm, quietly nudged into early retirement after the scandal made him a subject of one too many hallway conversations. He lost, perhaps most painfully, the easy warmth of his mother's unconditional approval. She still loved him, of course, but something in her had gone cautious and quiet since watching her golden son unravel over a woman who had never technically existed. He reached out to me more than once during that year, long emails apologetic and raw, admitting things he'd never admitted during our marriage, that he'd been restless before. Sophia ever appeared chasing some version of excitement he thought our steady life together couldn't offer him, only to learn the hard way that excitement built on lies collapses faster and more completely than any boredom ever could. He asked more than once, gently, and then less gently, whether there was any chance of us finding our way back to each other. I said no every time. Not out of cruelty, and not out of some performance of strength for an audience that wasn't there. I said no, because somewhere in that year of silence and testimony and rebuilding, I had genuinely moved forward in a way I hadn't expected to and couldn't have forced even if I'd tried. I was promoted that spring, given command responsibilities I'd worked toward for years. I bought a small house of my own outside base, nothing extravagant, just mine, every wall and window chosen without needing anyone else's approval. I slept well most nights, which I hadn't fully appreciated as a marker of healing, until I noticed how long it had been since I'd woken at 3 a.m. replaying old arguments. I ran into Ethan by accident near the end of that year, in a coffee shop close to the courthouse where the last of the sentencing hearings had wrapped up that morning. He looked older, not just tired the way he had on my porch that evening, but older in some more permanent way, the kind of aging that comes from finally understanding how much of what you believed about yourself wasn't true. We sat for a few minutes, coffee going lukewarm between us, and he asked me a question that had clearly been sitting in him for a while. "Did you ever laugh at me?" he asked. "Back then, at the wedding, Rachel told me you were smiling the whole time you were there." I thought about how to answer that honestly, because he deserved honesty even now, even after everything. "No," I said. "I laughed because the moment I saw her face, I knew the ending before anyone else in that room did. It wasn't about you being foolish, Ethan. It was about carrying a truth I couldn't share and watching it move toward its own conclusion, whether I said anything or not." He nodded slowly, like that answer settled something in him he'd been carrying since that Thursday on my porch. We didn't promise to stay in touch. We didn't need to. Some chapters close cleanly once both people finally understand the whole story. I walked outside afterward into a bright, ordinary morning sunlight, catching on the buttons of my uniform the way it always did, no fanfare, no dramatic music, just an average Tuesday, in a life I'd rebuilt one deliberate choice at a time. I thought about everything that had happened to the file I'd carried in silence for over a decade. The wedding I'd almost skipped, the year of quiet waiting that had felt at times like doing nothing at all. And I understood something I hadn't fully grasped until that exact moment, standing on an ordinary sidewalk with coffee in hand. Sometimes revenge isn't exposing the lie. Sometimes it's staying silent while the truth reveals itself on its own. I didn't destroy my ex-husband's second marriage. His own choices did. All I did was refuse to stand in front of a truth that was always going to arrive with or without my help. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you. Leave a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you the longest. I read every single one. We share stories like this every day, real ones about resilience, dignity, and the quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. So if that's something you want more of in your life, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Let's keep walking this road together.